Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Danielle McLaughlin, and I'm here this afternoon with my co-host, Madeleine Darcy, and this month's guest author, the wonderful Sarah Moore Fitzgerald. We had hoped that we would be live in the Friary Bar in North Mall today, but unfortunately, given the current COVID situation, we decided that it would be best to run this as an online event instead. Before we begin, I'd like to very briefly thank our sponsors, who this year are the Arts Council, Cork City Council, Cork City Libraries, the Department of English, UCC, Hogan Architects, J. Rappomar Solicitors, and Mike Darcy of the Friary Bar. And now I'm going to hand you over to Madeleine, who is going to introduce Sarah.
I'm absolutely delighted that we have Sarah Moore Fitzgerald as our guest here at our final event of 2021. Sarah has many strings to her bow, but what we'll be talking mostly about today is her work as an author. She's written 6 novels for children and young adults, with a 7th, which is going to be out, I think, in July 2022. She's been shortlisted for the Waterstones Prize, the Irish Book Awards, CBI Book of the Year, and has received a Kirkus Star in the US for exceptional merit in children's literature. Her work has been adapted for the stage and translated into over 18 different languages. She's also a writer and an academic, a professor at the University of Limerick, with a research background in psychology, organizational behavior and pedagogy. And she was Ireland's first chair of the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education. She was the University of Limerick's Dean of Teaching and Learning from 1999 to 2009, and Associate Vice President Academic from then until 2017. And I don't know how she does all of this, but she's merged her academic and creative practice, and she's now in the creative writing team of the University of Limerick. She's part of a Children's Books Ireland national project, Every Child a Reader. She is the voluntary project manager and leader of an Arts Council funded project called Walls of Limerick, and she is developing the main creative writing and also University of Limerick's creative writing winter school, plus much more. Her first novel was Back to Blackrick, and she's also written A Very Good Chance, The List of Real Things, A Strange Kind of Brave, and what a title, The Apple Tart of Hope. And most recently, she's written All the Money in the World, which was Children's Book of the Week in July 2021. Her work has been described as great storytelling with a moral core, and it's been lauded by so many. The Apple Tart of Hope has been described by the Telegraph as this novel has hidden powers, and young readers will be hooked from the get-go. A Very Good Chance, for example, has been described as a life-affirming read about readership across a social divide. Back to Blackrick is a tearjerker with lessons in how to live life to the full. I have totally enjoyed reading these stories, and I think it's appropriate now in November, coming up to Christmas, to have somebody who writes these wonderful, wonderful books for children and young adults. So it's a great pleasure to have you with us, Sarah. We've got lots of questions for you. But first of all, we were hoping that you might read an extract maybe from All the Money in the World, which was published this year.
I'd love to do that. Thank you, Madeleine and Danielle, for those lovely introductions. I think that, you know, that big list of achievements is more about the passage of time and reminding me how old I am than anything else. Finding things to do in life is important, I guess, as you get older particularly. And but it's also lovely to hear you say that thing about merging my two the two streams of my life, because it took me ages to get here, but now that I'm teaching creative writing at UL, it just feels like this is kind of what I'm supposed to be doing, you know, so it's really full of joy. I'm really enjoying this phase. And yes, I'm going to read from my latest book, as Madeline says, All the Money in the World, which is about a girl called Penny who lives in poverty with you know, she's got really good friends. This is written for a kind of a children's young, you know, middle grade audience. So kind of if you're 10 or 11 or 12 or 13, that's the kind of age group. But I hope it'll be a story that would be enjoyed by anybody. And there's a character in the book, her name is Violet Fitzsimons. And at the beginning of the story, the children who live in the flats, live quite just next door to her, are really afraid of her. They have never seen her. There are lots of rumors. She's quite an old woman, and there are lots of rumors that she's a terrifying monster or a witch of some kind, which seems to be a thing that happens to older women, that they become demonized in strange ways that we don't fully understand. There's a kind of a darkness about the way older women are treated in the world still. And this plays itself out in the story until Penny discovers that in actual fact, Violet Fitzsimons is a fabulous person with loads and loads of brilliant things about her. And one of the most important things is that she is a wonderful pianist, and that she plays one day when Violet when Penny rather is passing by Violet's kind of secluded home, she sees that there's a window open and she hears this wonderful music that she's never heard before floating out, and it just captivates her, and she's having a really hard time in her own life. And so this becomes a kind of a doorway into a better life for her. So we start to see this relationship build. And Violet, between the jigs and the reels, she decides that she's going to, or she offers to give Penny piano lessons. And that starts to go really well, and Penny is thriving. But one day, Penny has a terrible experience at school. And when she arrives for her lesson, she's really just shaken and unhappy. And like all brilliant teachers, Violet knows that Penny isn't going to be able to learn or practice anything that day. So she decides she's going to do something different and just play some music for her while she sits on the soft sofa drinking tea and gathering herself. So this is the moment when Violet, in her kindness, is playing one of her favorite pieces of music that Penny has never heard. And I'll just start reading now, and I'm going to play a little bit of the music in the background when the second movement comes, so don't be startled when you hear that. If you've heard Beethoven's Sonata No. 8, then I don't have to describe it, and if you haven't heard it, then I can't explain. But it's as if someone wise has begun to tell you a story that has no words, only feelings and great understanding. And when it speeds up, it's like 100 people dancing, and layers of different themes and threads and notes make you weighted to the ground. You can't move when this music is playing. It makes statues of us all. The dance happens inside you, in a deeper part of you. Allegro di molto e con brio, shouted Violet over the music, and I was jolted out of my stillness for a second, practically knocking the tea tray off its table. Movement nearly over, she shouted again, and finished with a glorious bam, 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 and was still. Then she whispered, second movement, as if there was something coming that I needed to be especially prepared for. Adagio cantabile. Here it comes. She bent her head like someone saying a prayer and held her fingers over the keyboard, and I will never forget where I was and how it felt and how the air landed on my skin the first time I heard it. Sonata No. 8, movement No. 2. Adagio cantabile means slowly, song-like, designed to imitate the human voice in music. But as far as I was concerned, the music imitated nothing but itself. All the sadness, all the beauty, all the longing, all the regret, all the hope, all the love, all the imperfection, all the dreams, all the goodness, all the peace swirling around in the room. It felt to me like Violet's playing was pulling the music out of the walls of her house, bringing an ancient and glorious thing into the space, a thing that had always been there waiting, but could only be brought to life by the touch of her elegant fingers on the silky keys.
I absolutely loved that reading, Sarah, and the music added so much to it. I was so delighted to read about fantastical characters like Violet, who's so magical, and her interaction with a young girl who's from an underprivileged background, and she really wants to get somewhere and overcome her disadvantages. She's just lovely. One of the things about that is that I love the way your characters speak, because these are very definitely Irish children, and occasionally there's somebody who's got, I think, a different accent, like Violet, who's from a more upper class background. But your dialogue and the voice is always very natural. And sometimes in Irish writing, you have sort of, dialogue that is maybe a little bit stage Irishy, and this isn't like that at all. And I believe you were born in America and you were brought to Ireland. And I'm wondering if that has heightened your ability to listen to dialogue and get it right.
I was really small when I came back to Ireland. My parents both Irish, but they myself and my older brother were born in New York. And I suppose I would have grown up on lots of stories about people from different, I mean, in an Ireland which was still quite homogenous. I think my parents' influence and the time they'd spent in New York and the different people that used to come and visit us in our home in Ireland really did, I think it did make me kind of attuned to, or at least interested in, the way people speak and how different turns of phrase are, and how you can live in the same town and have a very different kind of voice, but especially if you're from another place. And so a voice was always really, I remember myself always being really interested in how people spoke, and remarking probably quite rudely as a child on if someone spoke a word differently than the way I spoke it. So I think it was something I had an ear for from the time I was really young, and an interest in.
It was magnificent to hear that music playing while you were reading, and you write music so gloriously in the novel. It's absolutely wonderful. And I felt like I was really inside the mind and heart of someone for whom music was, a whole additional language. And I want to ask you where you got that depth of understanding of music.
Well, Danielle, I mean, the two of you, honestly, you're so generous. As writers whose work I admire so much, to hear you talking about my books like this, both of you, I can't tell you how thrilled it makes me feel, and how generous you are to give me this time, and like the whole music piece. Yeah, I mean, I am not a musician, and I am definitely not a singer. My children and family will tell you that. I mean, I am a singer, but I'm not a good singer. It was, yeah, like, you can't ever say I don't sing, but even though because I sing all the time, but I don't sing well. But I just adore music. Music is, I don't understand people who don't listen to music. I think it's kind of almost compulsory, and I can kind of construct soundtracks for different phases in my life. And the arrival of Spotify has been an absolute breakthrough for me, because now I can actually track what I've been listening to in a year. Like, you can do these compilations for which songs were you listening to in 2020. And that, for me, I mean, apart from the chilling Big Brother aspect of that, for me, it's just brilliant to be able to kind of trace back the kind of, it's like an audiology or something, maybe that's not a word, but the history of your listening life and of music. So music is just essential to my life. And I remember moments where I first heard a song. I remember where I was driving a Mini coming back from college years and years ago, and you'll know, you can date it because of the time of the song. And I first heard Rise by Public Image Limited. And it was like I thought it was like being on drugs or something. I just was so excited and so elated at the sound and what it felt like to listen to it for the first time. And every time I listen to that song, it's a bit like trying to kind of get the same hit again. Like I don't quite get the same feeling, but I remember where I was and who I was and how I felt. So music is really wrapped up in my, like it is for many people, in my identity, in my memories, in my relationships, in in so many parts of my life. Music has played and continues to play a really important part. And I was always very keen to see if I could write about the riches of music. There's a passage at the very end of the novel All the Money in the World, and where she realizes it's music that saved her, not all the other things. Not that money doesn't matter, because it does, and I didn't want to be simplistic about that, but how music, like all art, can save us, and how it's what we cling to at times of trauma and difficulty, and what we celebrate at times of joy and triumph. So it's life without music is an unthinkable thing for me.
That joy of music came across so strongly in the novel. It's, music, as you said there, it's one of the riches that Penny gets in her life. And Penny Nolan, so she's 15. It's kind of a rags to riches story, a modern retelling. And can you remember what first prompted you to tell Penny's story? What was it that first sparked it for you?
I mean, where do you want me to start? I've always wanted to write a rags to riches story. I mean, Cinderella, A Little Princess, The Secret Garden, Pretty Woman, like I just am an absolute sucker for rags to riches. And I also think there's, children, this was kind of coupled with my observation that children now are presented over and over again in the work, in kind of through social media and access to information, with these dazzling pictures of unattainable wealth and success and glamour. And in my experience, from what I've seen of that, it normally makes children feel really inadequate and deficient and bad about themselves, rather than excited and delighted. And I tell my children all the time, don't compare other people's shop fronts with your real lived life, because the shop front is a fiction, And yet I also all of those ideas, I was really interested in rags to riches. Very early on in my writing career, a person in the publishing world said to me, "Oh, children aren't really interested in money. Like, you should never write a book about money for children, because they don't worry about money." This was a woman, obviously, who had never worried about money in her life. And in my experience, children whose parents are struggling financially know all about it. Every single waking moment is occupied with this concern, because even when parents do their best to try to protect their children, if parents are in poverty, then the children are going to feel that in some way or another, no matter how hard their parents try to protect them. And children often do this kind of rather grandiose thing, saying, "I'm going to get rich and I'm going to rescue my family from this, and I'm going to buy my dad a huge boat, and I'm going to, send my mum on a massive holiday." And like you hear very poignantly children who are often in financially difficult situations having those kinds of fantasies. And it's not just children in those situations. We all have the kind of, what would I do if I won the lottery thing. So it's the stuff of fantasy. And I was really keen to kind of differentiate between what really does help when you've got the money that you need and what doesn't, So the whole idea that if you don't feel good about yourself on the inside, if you don't have some kind of core, solid sense of self-esteem, then all the money in the world isn't going to make any difference. But I also didn't want to be unrealistic, as I said a while ago. I didn't want to be facetious, because money does matter and money does make a difference. And if a child doesn't have enough money, and if her family doesn't have enough money, then there's just loads of opportunities that are not available to her. And so I didn't want to be I didn't want to sanitize that part of the story. And so I was trying to see if I could write a kind of a real good Cinderella story, but also with an understanding of what money actually does mean and what it doesn't mean in the world, because we talk about money all the time. And even when we're not talking about it, we're often thinking about it. And I just thought it would be a really good, I've been longing to write it, really. And I finally gave myself permission on my 6th. I just said, okay, this time I'm going to tackle it. So I was really glad that I gave it a go. And I'm really happy with how Penny kind of, she sort of tumbled onto the page, really. It's normally a much more torturous process writing a novel, but this one was easy. I think it probably because the ideas and the images and the themes had been bubbling away for years and years.
On those themes, Sarah, one of the things I love is the twins that are there in the novel. There's twin sisters, there's also twin houses, if you like, and they have very different life experiences. What led you were you consciously choosing a twin image to work with?
Like they sort of emerged. I felt, and in fact, if you look at the cover of the book, it's sort of dichotomized. There's two sides to it. And there was kind of the flats, which were Rosemary House, and then Violet, which was Lavender House, and the different lives of the different ways those two buildings emerged. And then, of course, Violet and her sister, and her long lost sister. So the idea of people being really connected, and yet this kind of severance, and what happens to people when they're separated. So I'm fascinated by twins. I have cousins who are twins, a boy and a girl. Well, they're grown up now, man and a woman now, but I'm just really fascinated by twins anyway. And I think, to have developed at the same time in the same body, to have been born at the same time, to share so much of your own DNA, I just think that's fascinating. And I'm really fascinated by books about twins. So yeah, I think, but I don't know if I was that conscious about it. I think it just crept in because of the dichotomies and the connections I was exploring. Somehow twins became a metaphor for some of the other things I was doing in the book.
The wonderful thing is that there are so many themes in all 6 novels that are so interesting. There's the granddad in your first novel, Back to Black Brick, has Alzheimer's. As I said to you before, I felt like crying at the end, but I was really happy as well. It was I was crying in a good way. It had elements that reminded me of Catcher in the Rye. And even again, as I was saying, your dialogue, in Catcher in the Rye, the American character says lousy, but in a completely different way. We hear in Ireland say, oh, that's pure lousy, it was wonderful. And then, of course, as with the book we're talking about now, all the money in the world, it's a gifted child who from a deprived background, and then there's bullying, and there's bereavement, money issues, social deprivation. And I love that these are issue-driven stories told in such an accessible way. But I'm wondering, when you're beginning to write, do you choose your theme first in your head, or is it character-driven? Do you find a character and then that character sort of takes you along into these lovely, eventful, moving stories?
I think the character has to always come first. But the funny thing about All the Money in the World is I had this theme for ages, and I just was like, I've been writing for 15 years, but I was going, I really want to write about that, but I can't write about a theme until a character announces herself, and so it wasn't until Penny sort of came along that I realized that she was the character that could drive this story in a way. So I really like to think that I put my characters in the driving seat, and I try to stay kind of open about because I kind of said, well, yeah, I think I'll write Rags to Riches, but I was going to wait and see what Penny did. Like sometimes I'll set out to write a story. I mean, another of my books is called A Strange Kind of Brave, and that book started out about, this is how it started. I thought I was going to write about a bunch of angels who looked like humans. They're kind of like aliens, but they're angels, and they live underground, an old mental hospital like the one in Cork, you know, which is so fascinating to me. So they live in this underground warren under an old ruined mental hospital. That was my starting point. And it ended up being about a boy and his mother who moved to a small town and opened up a restaurant. You know, like it was completely different. So I've learned to trust the idea that your characters will kind of decide. I can't remember who it was. Maybe it was Raymond Carver who said no, it wasn't Raymond Carver. Somebody who said the book is the boss. You know, you actually, as soon as you feel you're in control, that's when you get into trouble. I think you've really got to allow whatever it is that's insisting itself onto the page. You've got to allow that to happen. And it's more like you're just marshalling that and you're trying to create a container for that rather than deciding on what it's going to be.
You mentioned a restaurant there. I loved the Italian restaurant that, without a spoiler, kind of saved a whole community, really. But food, Sarah, food. You must be a wonderful cook, I think, or you're very interested in food. Obviously, the apple tart of hope. I mean, there is, folks, there's a recipe available for the actual apple tart, which I am going to try.
Like the food thing is really important for me, Madeline. Like somebody says that, in order to understand culture, you have to understand three things: music, language, and food. And our relationship with those three things and the way those three things manifest themselves in a culture almost defines what a culture is. And that's really interesting to me. And I love that whole thing about how there's a kind of a folklore associated with food, like, your granny's recipe or the thing that she always did. Like my grandmother always used to take the cold butter out of the fridge and grate the butter. And that's like, make sure you grate the butter. Don't ever do anything else. Like, don't ever wait for it to get soft, or don't cut it up into cubes, but grate it. And it's kind of like this, it's like they're like spells or something, they're like magical rituals that have huge emotional import to them. Like when people talk about food, there's a brilliant analysis of like the guys on death row who order their final meals, and it's so poignant to see that so many of them didn't have any food ritual. They order like just food that is soulless, that doesn't have any sense of a memory of family or caring or nurturing or anything like that. So it's another one of those things like music. It's just central to who we are and to how we interact with each other and to how we feel about ourselves. And if you have a really healthy relationship with food, then you tend to be just a really happy person. And if you have an unhealthy relationship with food, which we don't, like, even if we have a healthy relationship, we sometimes have dysfunctional moments with food. So it's really complicated, and it's really, I think food can strike at the heart of understanding a group of people or a family or a town. And of course, Ariana in A Strange Kind of Brave, she understands that rituals around food. She has this expression, cose di fare di così, which is like how things are done, and often teenagers kind of really resist that. They're just like, oh, why do we have to all sit down for dinner on Sunday? And yet, as that creeps into someone's sense of who they are, it becomes a really important, they realize how important it is. So yeah, I mean, the themes, food and music, and as you say, horses. I know nothing about horses. I'm really badly allergic to horses, and so I had to do a lot of research. But I think I have a secret fantasy that that I could be some kind of, brilliant horse rider, riding bareback in the Palio in Siena or something. I just have this alter ego that could do that, and that's why it's one of the reasons I suppose I write books, is that the things I can't do in real life I can write about in books and sort of feel like it's happened to me.
Thank you so much. I found myself cheering for your characters because I am a sucker for a happy ending, really. I think we all are, but a lot of modern fiction has maybe some epiphanies, but is not often particularly joyous. And some people even say that the novel is dead. You know, they're a sort of hybrid creative nonfiction, memoir, etc., etc., all sorts of books that are quite different, I think, that don't make what Claire Keegan calls the incision in time, which is what you always do, which I love, which is you just take us with your character, place us in there and take us on this journey of ups and downs and stories and meeting people and doing things and struggling and hopefully overcoming some of the odds by the end. But what do you think? Do you think that this idea that, you know, the novel is kind of out of fashion now? And
Yeah,
really...
I mean, like you, I do hear, we hear this all the time, you know, and I have to say, I love and welcome and celebrate all the new forms that we're seeing. You know, you mentioned autofiction and biofiction and kind of, you know, something that's kind of a mix between, you know, biography and fiction. And you and I, Madeleine, met with Kerry Nee Doherty in Drummondere. And like her book is just astonishing. It's like nothing I've ever read before. And we're seeing that in other people's writing, like Doireann Griff is another example. Sinead Gleason's essays that just completely took off. So I welcome that diversity, but I don't believe that the novel is dying or dead. And I believe that if people think the novel is dead, it's just going to rise again and again and again, because we need stories. You know, human beings, our longings and our goals and the things we want and the things we do to get them and the things we're afraid of and the lengths that we will go to avoid and the things we're afraid of. This is the story of all of us. And every single plotted novel is just shines another light on those basic human things. And if we don't have that story, then a bit like food or language or music, then we've lost something that's just essential to ourselves. So if the novel gets murdered at some point, then it's gonna rise again. I have complete faith that the novel is never going to die, though.
One of my favorite books when I was actually 17 and I was an au pair in Paris was The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. And I still really love that kind of simplicity. One of the things you said in an interview was that the book you'd buy for a friend's child on their 18th birthday would be A Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy O'Toole, and that you also like the character Holden Caulfield from Catcher in the Rye. And why do you like these books? Confederacy of Dunces is a very interesting choice, I think.
Oh, I mean, I read that at a really formative stage in my life, and I don't know whether it was because of the moment I read it or whether it was because of the story, but there was something that really, really captivated me about the main character in that book that kind of speaks to the kind of that sort of false jadedness of the teenager, you know, I think. And Holden Caulfield is exactly the same, you know. There's a sort of a freedom in recognizing that you don't have to toe the line, that you're not a little kid anymore, that you can have these crazy adventures and that you can be flawed and dreadful and still be a legitimate person in the world, because every teenager feels those things. I think, you know, the story of the Confederacy of Dunces and the fact that he was long dead before the story became a success is kind of a lovely thing to know. Like, hang on is the other thing, you know, it could all turn out fabulously. You just have to keep going. And I think we forget how dreadful it is. Being a teenager is really, really hard. I can only imagine how difficult it is now. But what I love to do, Madeleine, is I don't think just kind of to pick up on both those choices and also some of the earlier things we were talking about. Nothing should be off limits, you know. Of course, when you're writing for children and young adults, you should do no harm, but you should recognize that you're writing about a world in which harm often happens and harm is often done. And we have no right, in fact, we have a responsibility not to sanitize or patronize or minimize or diminish what are really huge issues in the lives of young people. And so I think it's our responsibility to write about dark things. And my first book, you've talked about Back to Blackbrick, that was, my dad was dying with Alzheimer's while I was writing that book. And I think it was really one of the reasons that kind of tipped me over into really taking my writing seriously, because I was devastated and I had nowhere to go with this dreadful sadness that was following me around. And I was supposed to be a grown-up woman. I was, 3 children and, a busy job. And I had this whole ocean of despair and desperation in me because of my beloved dad and what was happening to him. And I didn't know, I thought I was going to go crazy because I was carrying this around with nothing to do with it, except just sit with it and live with it. And so I began to write, and Back to Blackbrick became a kind of love letter to my dad, really. And while it's completely fictional, I mean, Granddad is totally based on my dad, and Cosmo is the angry child that was in me, even though I was a grown-up woman. I was actually like, I was a child and I was grieving, and I had nowhere to go to tell anybody about that. And that's why I wrote Back to Blackbrick.
It's a very magical book, and it's got it's manages to be so funny whilst also really sad. I mean, Cosmo's attempts to cure his granddad's Alzheimer's are hilarious, and yet it's really touching. And all of the novels have got that quality of feeling very real, whilst at the same time being a story that is certainly fiction, so there's a lot in them. They're so entertaining. But going back to you and your own life, how do you manage to do all of this? Because you've got an academic career, you've got 3 children, I think.
Yeah.
You've got all of this creative work, and you also teach, I think, isn't it in Doolin that you've got the creative writing winter school?
Yeah.
How do you manage all of this? I mean, I did look at your website, and you've got a time management course for creative writers, an online event on the 8th of January in the new year. And I think I am going to have to sign up for this because I need to know, how do you manage it all, Sarah? Are you very efficient with your time?
Oh, I'm not at all. I'm complete, that's why I have loads of theories about time management for creative people, because they're not the same as time management for people who are, more organized and more structured. In order to be creative, you have to be really messy. You have to be quite unstructured. And that you often feel quite deficient because you're those things. I don't know, does that ring a bell with the two of you? Maybe you're both super organized as well, but I always feel like, the center is about to just kind of collapse as opposed to hold, that kind of feeling. And yet I think it's that sort of fizz in your life that makes you be creative. So one of the things I've been playing with is, there's this old kind of mnemonic called SMART goals, which is specific, measurable, ambitious, realistic, and time bound. But if you tell that to a creative person, they just panic. They go, but I don't have a specific goal and it can't be time bound. And so I'm going to use this kind of new mnemonic that I've invented called unreal goals, which is like, unclear, non-specific, expansive, whatever, I can't remember, lavish, just that you have to create moments in your day where time doesn't matter. Because if you're worrying about the time, you're not going to be worrying about your story. You're not going to be focused on your story. And so there's this bizarre paradox that in order to manage time well as a creative, you have to ignore time, or at least you have to have moments in every day where time is irrelevant, where everything is irrelevant, really, where you're not conscious about yourself, you're not conscious about time. There's a lot of work in academia and research that talks about flow. Csikszentmihalyi talks about this being in flow, and being in flow is that kind of exquisite, space between anxiety on one hand and boredom on the other, where you're just in the moment. Athletes call it being in the zone, where you actually don't even understand why you're as good as you are, but you're just doing it. It's like you're walking on water. You're doing an impossible thing. And it usually means you're pushing yourself in an area that you're already very good at. You two know this because you've written just exquisite books. And so something has happened, even though you don't believe it yourself necessarily, that has allowed you suddenly to clarify a moment or a scene where everything makes sense. You really creative people talk about this moment that often happens when you've done a lot of work on a book, where suddenly something solves itself. You suddenly go, I know exactly how this is going to work now. And everything just seems to kind of fall into place. So in order for that to happen, we have to have a different kind of relationship with time. And so we can't manage time in the ways that people conventionally suggest that we should. We have to enter new time zones. And I mean, I don't, because I have so many other things on in my life, I don't write for very long every day, but when I start a project, I write every day. And I'm kind of proof that you can write novels in 15 minutes a day. Now, that's a bit of a kind of, that's not completely true, because after a significant amount of 15 minutes, I then usually take this messy project off somewhere for a few days on my own and try and figure out what it's about. And then I go back. But I really played a terrible trick on myself the first time I went to Anna McCarrick, because I made so much progress up there at a very early stage in my writing. And then when I came back to my real life, I was like, but I can't write unless I'm in Anna McCarrick. And that's a terrible thing to do. I mean, Anna McCarrick's a wonderful place, or any writing retreat is a wonderful place. But the real thing is to figure out is how to write in the context of a really busy life, in the nooks and crannies of your day. And that's what I'm going to be talking about in January. You can come along, Madeleine. I'd love you to be there. You probably have loads to share about that yourself too.
I'm not sure about that. I can share a lot about. I feel like probably most of my life is spent putting things in the washing machine for some reason. I'm addicted to doing that instead of doing what I'm supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
And then not cleaning the rest of the house. But I digress.
Sarah, you have a new novel coming out next year, I believe. Would you be able to read us a little snippet?
I'd love to do that. I have it here in front of me, and just keep it still needs to be, I'm going to do one big final edit on it. So excuse if there's any clunky moments or if I'm tripping over some of these sentences. It's called The Shark and the Scar. And it's about a boy called Jay and his dad, and a terrible thing that happens and how they try to escape from it. And this is just the very opening chapter, and it's the first time I've read it aloud to anybody, so this is a real privilege too. When Jay Danaher finally woke up, he could only stare for a long time into the night-dimmed room, slowly adapting to the new reality of his situation. The whole right side of his body was stiff and swollen. Bandages covered his torso, his arm, his shoulder, his leg. It hurt to move. A cuff on his left bicep growled to life without warning, filling with air, then squeezing his arm tight before deflating again. He tried to remember what had happened, but the effort felt useless and exhausting, as if he was opening his eyes under mud-blackened water or leaning against a thick, locked door. He did not immediately see his father, who was sleeping in a chair right next to him, very close. But as his awareness grew, the shape of his dad became clear. "Dad," he said in a gluey whisper. "Where am I? What happened?" Jay's dad jolted awake like someone who'd been stung by a wasp and leaned forward as if to kiss his son, but stopped at the last minute. "You're in hospital, buddy. You're okay. I've been right here the whole time." Jay could see huge grey patches like stains or bruises under his father's eyes. He thought about the last time he'd heard his voice. "Keep your eyes open, Jay. Don't go to sleep. Hold on. Stay with us." And in that moment, other haphazard images came back to him, a strange collection of objects flung in confusing order on the beach of his disjointed memory. The sparkle of the sea, a sudden frenzied chaos, a churning, a splashing. his body caught up by the water in an unwilling slow motion dance, a black reddening explosion of blood, a feeling of being pushed above the surface, gasping for air, the raggy groan of his own voice, a scream high-pitched and hysterical, a horrible roar like an engine or a lion. He could remember a sickening, dragging pain and how this had overtaken him and how he had not been able to withstand the pull of the dark. There had been a tiny instant of peaceful relief as his world blurred and faded, and then after that, nothing. Nothing, that is, until he'd woken to find himself in a hospital bed with the bleeping machines and the high white walls and the face of his tired father in this strange new season of blankness.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. That's just brilliant. Thanks a million. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you.
It's gone so fast. You just made it so easy, and you're such lovely interviewers, and I've had such a lovely time. I could stay here all day talking to you both.
A huge thank you to Sarah Moore Fitzgerald for being our guest author this month and for those wonderful readings and fascinating chat. We highly recommend her books, and All the Money in the World is superb. It's published by Orion. We're having an online book raffle this month. So if you go to our Twitter account at Fiction Friary or to our Facebook page, Fiction at the Friary, there will be details there on how you can take part in the free book raffle. And we look forward to welcoming you all back again to Fiction at the Friary in January 2022, when hopefully we will be live in person at the Friary Bar. And in the meantime, thanks to everyone for tuning in during 2021, and it's goodbye from us for the moment.
Thank you so much. So lovely to see the two of you, and I'll definitely come in January to whoever's on and to meet you in person. It'd be so lovely. Thanks a million.
Thanks a million, and we hope to see you in real life as soon as possible.